forum on land, environment and society, and our departmental indexing transformation Melon project seminar series, and it's really great to be doing this in person. I think it's the first time we've done it in person, so this is a breakthrough.
Video.
Video?
The camera.
Oh yeah. So this is a great moment to have you in person.
Oh.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I found out that Professor Thomas Hylland Eriksen from University of Oslo in Norway is currently at STIAS, and we made contact and very generously, very quickly said, I'm available anytime, which is always good to know, because not all STIAS fellows are as generous as you are. Some say, oh, no, I'm writing this book.
All right, yeah.
I know. Generally are quite generous. But this is a great opportunity also to get exposed to your most recent project, which is the title of the talk. But Professor Eriksen has done fieldwork in a variety of contexts in Trinidad, Mauritius, Norway, and Australia, Seychelles as well, and a whole range of issues ranging from identity, nationalism, globalization, and identity politics. He's also been very instrumental in popularizing socioanthropology, and all of us use his textbooks, the Small Places, Large Issues. That usually starts off one of my courses. And in addition, a whole range of other books which I'll get to, including a major textbook called Ethnicity and Nationalism, Anthropological Perspectives. In addition, Professor Eriksen is a regular contributor in the public sphere in Norway on a whole range of issues. He's also politically engaged in the Green Party in Norway. And so a real example of an engaged scholar. And when it comes to the publications, just simply in English, the list is overwhelming. I'll try and rapidly go through some and just give people a sense of the topics that you've addressed. Ethnicity and nationalism, I'm skipping out of that's in 1993 and then 2010, and most of these books have been widely translated. Common denominators, ethnicity, nationalism, and the politics of compromise in Mauritius, 1998, and History of Anthropology, co-editor. Tyranny of the Moment, Fast and Slow Time in the Information Age, in 2001, and numerous other books on, so almost every year a new book comes out. And so the topics are globalization, what is anthropology, engaging anthropology, paradoxes of cultural recognition, a title of the edited volume in 2009, and moving very fast to the more recent work, which I'm particularly interested in, given its environmental focus, Overheating, which is part of a big project that has produced a number of publications. And I'm sure you will sort of refer to that work and how it relates to the current project. And so the title of the project is precisely that, biological and cultural diversity, implications of Anthropocene effects. And we were just chatting now, I think I'll speak for myself. I used to teach anthropology of development, and it was all about critiques of modernization, of and then dependency and post-development and a whole range of things. And eventually I woke up to this climate catastrophe that is precisely a product of modernity and all these ideas of progress and these projects of development. And it's a massive expanding field, and I'm very pleased that you're here to really also give us a sense of how you've moved along through this trajectory. And we spoke about also early on more focused on development, globalization, but now these are very crucial issues all over the world.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Thanks so much for your very kind introduction, and And thanks to the two of you for inviting me to give this talk. It's about time. I mean, I've been at STIAS for 2 months now, so I'm very pleased to be able to come home for a moment. I mean, to my own people in a way, because STIAS is stimulating. It's mind-boggling, and it's so diverse. It's in terms of intellectual and academic backgrounds that I learn something new every day over lunch, and which is a privilege, of course, to be grateful for. At my age, it's not something that you can take for granted, and so it's wonderful. But it's great to be here. So I'm going to really give you the scaffolding of a rather major new project, and these are still early days for me. Okay, so you must bear with me. And if you have any very serious objections to anything of what I'm saying, I'd be very pleased. You know, I'd be very happy with that, because then I can make adjustments as I go along. Because not much has been published from this project yet. A couple of articles, nothing very major. I haven't done any fieldwork on it yet, but I will. And I'm collecting stories also from other people's fieldwork that I might want to use in order to try to make sense of this. So what is this project about, and how does it relate to other things that we do in anthropology and in sociology? Well, I think one way of thinking about this is by reflecting on the way we have tried to conceptualize modernity. I mean, the theory of nationalism was very much, to a great extent, about the way in which cultural differences are being erased or flattened, the homogenization of large populations. You know, Imagine Communities by Benedict Anderson, one of the formative, foundational texts in the recent study of nationalism, is about the printing press and about the way in which print capitalism led to the standardization of vernacular languages, and also led to the production of cultural communities where people could eventually feel that they had a lot in common, although they would never meet. You know, the anonymous community. I once asked Benedict Anderson about the title, because Imagine Communities does somehow have a ring of something imaginary, and that's not his intention at all. So I said, why didn't you call it Abstract Communities instead? Because then it would have been a more accurate title. And he then looked at me and said, my dear friend, who would then have bought the book? And he was entirely correct, because Imagine Community is a beautiful, evocative title, but it's not about the imaginary, but it's about the way in which we have to use our imagination for these communities to exist, because they are abstract. So that's one sort of, for me, very important book that I read while I was doing research on the relationship between ethnic or communal identities and an overarching national identity in Mauritius. I mean, you South Africans may believe that you invented the concept of the rainbow nation, okay? But it was in use in Mauritius before the end of apartheid, in a comparable sense, really. I mean, la société arc-en-ciel, the idea that you can have a society which is not based on similarity, but on diversity and complementarity. And the same problems apply in Mauritius as in South Africa and elsewhere, namely that you can perfectly well have a very tolerant and respectful public sphere where everybody has a national day, you know, everybody has their sort of cultural shows, and at the same time you can reproduce a social hierarchy. There's no contradiction there. So the national culture of Mauritius, if there is one, is that of Creoles. It's the Creole culture. People of mainly African and Malagasy descent who speak a French-based Creole language, and they have produced, you know, poetry, music, visual art, and so on in a big way. So the leading sort of representatives of popular culture and fine culture in Mauritius have a Creole background. And at the same time, the Creoles are at the bottom of the ladder economically, socially, politically. They're powerless. They're never in government, or they may have a token representative in government. And they live, many of them, in what you in South Africa would call townships. I mean, cité ouvrière, which are basically, they are townships, really. Although there was no Group Areas Act. I mean, it's very similar. It's quite segregated, or in villages on the coast. So I was looking at this complexity, and I did basically the same thing when I went to Trinidad, which is interestingly comparable to Mauritius, because Trinidad in the Caribbean has a similar history of sugar plantations, of slavery, of Indian indentureship, and of a small sort of a pale-skinned elite that used to own all the plantations. So there are some interesting parallels that I explored in Trinidad. So this was, I think, this, you know, and this led me on to an interest in you know, modernity as a force that creates similarity at the expense frequently of excluding minorities. You know, you can assimilate them or you can exclude them. Nationalism rarely goes well with serious cultural diversity. So that's one way of thinking about the theory of nationalism, is that it's really one way of talking about the history of modernity. The history of modernity as this process whereby a world that used to consist of many small differences somehow is being transformed into a world of just a few major ones. And they're bounded, they have boundaries. So I mean, an anecdote that I sometimes use back home when I try to explain the theory of nationalism to students is by asking them to imagine a trip in the mid-18th century, before the beginning of serious nation building in Northern Europe. A trip from Bergen in the far west of Norway to Stockholm, the capital of Sweden. So then you cross the Scandinavian peninsula. If you did this trip, if you made this trip in the mid-18th century, you would notice that in every little community, every little valley, every little hamlet, they would have their own dialect, they would have their own sort of oral traditions, and they would be vaguely suspicious of everybody else, and certainly those from a neighboring valley. And so you could notice that there were differences, as it were, small differences in the way people lived, their outlook, and their identities. But you would not be able to tell exactly where the border was between the Norwegian and the Swedish identities. They merged into one another because the languages are so similar. So there, even today, there are traces of Swedish in some southeast Norwegian dialects, and there are traces of Norwegian on the other side of the border. So you couldn't really tell. But when you reach Stockholm, they spoke a very clear sort of beautiful standard Swedish, rikssvenska. Whereas in Bergen, they spoke a kind of Norwegian, hybridized, Creolized Norwegian influenced by Danish and German. If you made the same trip 100 years later, in the 1850s or 60s, you would notice that the dialectal variation was much less on both sides of the border. But as a compensation, you could tell exactly where the boundary went between the two countries. And even more so after the coming of the new media, of radio, television, migration to the cities, etc. So this is to a great extent what modernity has been about, isn't it? About the flattening, about what Ernest Gellner, in one of the other constitutive texts about the history of nationalism, speaks of as social entropy. He should have said cultural. I mean, social entropy is about the, you know, the erasure of difference. The second law of thermodynamics. He should have said cultural, because you didn't get social entropy. Classes still existed, hierarchy still existed, but culturally, people from rural areas could suddenly communicate easily with people from the cities. So there was something very radical about nationalism at the outset, because it was an inclusive ideology, which told the Serbian prince that he had more in common with the peasants who worked for him than with his horse, which in the past would not have been the case. He didn't identify with those peasants. He didn't care what language they spoke, as long as they did their job. He identified in a cosmopolitan way with nobility in other parts of Europe. So there was something very radical and inclusive about nationalism at the outset. We mustn't forget that, because nationalism is deservedly getting a lot of bad press these days for being an exclusionist ideology. So what happens? I mean, I think that's one of the questions we can ask when we study globalization, which I've also done in many ways for many years. The way in which global processes are being perceived locally and responded to locally, and how they affect people's lives locally. So that was the overheating project. I'm going to say just 2 words about that in a little while. So globalization, to some extent, is about, you could say it's about making differences comparable, making cultural differences comparable by producing a common language for talking about differences. This language is frequently the language of the market and the state, right? Money, I mean general purpose money, as we call it in the classic economic anthropology, which makes everything comparable with everything else, because it can be measured on the same scale. the state effects are well known also through some slightly more recent books, but I think quite important books. One of them is James Scott, Seeing Like a State, from the late 1990s, a book which shows how these large-scale projects, often well-intended, meant to improve, the lives of people, were bound to fail, because the people who were making the plans had no clue as to the diversity and the peculiarities and the character of life out there on the ground, as it were. The tyranny of models, as we might call it and this kind of critique is still often valid when we discuss with a certain kind of economists and a certain kind of social planners, where the model somehow gets a life on its own and becomes more important and more real than reality. So that's another way of thinking about, and a complementary way of thinking about the production, the creation of the contemporary world. You've got nation building, state building, marketization, and then from the 1980s, if I can zoom forward to the 1980s, we've seen the deregulation of markets and the massive dominance of neoliberalism. The idea that the market principle, the principle of competition, should apply everywhere, and how the World Trade Organization replaced in the early 90s the previous trade agreements, which were more specific and which could be bilateral and which could guarantee, for example, banana growers in small Caribbean islands quotas in the European Union. They were all gone. They now all had to compete on the same level playing field, as it were. And this was perceived and marketed as a kind of, as a form of progress. And it was around this time, the coming of neoliberalism as the sort of the general framework through which, the general lens through which the world was seen by the elites. It was in this, at this time, that Margaret Thatcher infamously said that there is no alternative. The Tina doctrine, there is no alternative, right? To global capitalism and to a certain form of what Francis Fukuyama at the time, the political scientist, spoke of as liberal democracy. So this is some of the, part of the sort of trajectory that many of us have followed. But then comes, climate and environment comes into the picture very soon. But this is part of the trajectory that many of us have followed. And we should not be ashamed of the fact that anthropology and sociology are influenced in their professional priorities by events in the outside world. After all, we're social sciences. So if something happens in the outside world, we have to relate it, we have to respond, we have to find ways of grappling with it. And this has always been the case in our discipline. Just think about the way in which in the last couple of years there's been a sort of a flurry of online publications and networks and edited books which are starting to come about the pandemic, about the COVID-19 pandemic. And they will continue to come because academic publishing can be quite slow. I've got a couple of book chapters myself in the pipeline which were written a year ago. And of course they should have been updated, but I don't think I'm going to do it. But you see what I mean. The Syrian refugee crisis in Europe in 2015-16. It also led to really sort of focused attention from social scientists. And this is just how it should be. We should be in dialogue with the outside world. But we mustn't forget who we are, and we mustn't forget the skills that we've accumulated. And in our case, for more than a century. And that's one of my hobby horses, that I think that although we now look at new phenomena, we should try to retain some of the classic skills that were developed under very different circumstances regarding, for example, how we do ethnography and maybe some other things that we could discuss. So let's move on. So what is happening now? And it is fairly recent. It is very much a 21st century phenomenon, is that the relationship between nature and society, or culture and nature, whatever you want to call it. There are so many ways we can talk about this, is being destabilized. And it is slowly dawning upon us as social scientists that we are part of, we're ecological creatures, that we're part of a broader ecology. And this is a lesson which has been slow in coming. And I think there is one big reason for it. And the big reason is that there were in the 1970s and to some extent in the 80s, some attempts by a certain kind of biologist to define social science as a branch of biology, okay? I mean, sociobiology. The book Sociobiology, published in 1975 by the now late E.O. Wilson, in his final chapter, I mean, most of the book is about insect societies and things that he really knew a lot about. He was a world authority on ants. But the last chapter is about the social sciences, where Wilson says towards the end that it is about time now that we reintegrate the social sciences into the mother discipline, namely biology, because everything is really about evolution when you look at it. And the kind of evolution that he was favorable to was also a kind of evolution that didn't sit comfortably with many anthropologists and sociologists. It was about competition and struggle, and not about the kind of phenomena that we might focus on in our work. So that, I think, is one reason that there has been some trepidation among anthropologists and sociologists in relating to biology. And this is now changing, and there are many different, some competing, some complementary, some overlapping attempts to try to bridge and to try to include the non-human in the kind of work that we do. Some more successful than others, but they're very understandable. So that's why I put this up. I mean, after all, the subject is called anthropology, anthropos. It's about humanity. Okay, humanities is also sort of many anthropologists relate and sociologists relate to the humanities. It's about humanism. It's about the human condition, and the social sciences. When we say social, we don't think about ant societies. We think about the kind of relationships that we have. The smallest entity that we study, or the smallest unit that we study, it's not the individual, it's a relationship between two. And for most, it has been taken for granted that those two are two human beings. They are not a human and a horse, or a human and a salmon, or a human and a trout, or a human and his or her Umwelt, his or her broader environment. So it's been restricted. And in classic anthropology, certainly in the British school, ecology was not really very present. It was not really very important. There was a branch of American anthropology where it was more important, but that's a different story, and I'm not going to. We can discuss that afterwards. So then we've got all these new concepts which attempt to reshape and to reconfigure our relationship with the outside world by speaking about the Anthropocene, which I think is the most, and it probably will be for some time, although it's contested, most common word in order to describe the point which we have now reached, because it has become almost impossible now to devise a major research project in anthropology. I'm not speaking for sociology because I don't know it well enough, but okay, in development sociology, without including an environmental element, and very often an element to do with climate. Stephen, since you mentioned this book that I've written and rewritten several times in 2 languages called Small Places, Large Issues, the latest edition in English came out in 2014, so there's going to be a new edition, possibly next year. But the latest Norwegian edition had been out since 2010. And I then realized, about a year ago, that if this book is going to continue, to chug on, it's got to be renewed. And there were a few things that were glaringly absent, even from the 2010 edition. Yes, there is a chapter about nature and culture, but it's very old-fashioned. And it's about human ecology and about hunters and gatherers. And, it's not about you and me living in urban society. And there's nothing about digitalization. And there were a few other things which were glaringly, as I say, absent from that edition. So when I revised it, which I did about a year ago, published last autumn in Norwegian, I had to have a chapter on the anthropology of climate. And I had to rewrite in a rather comprehensive way the chapters where I dealt with the culture-nature conundrum, because so much had happened in those intervening years, just in a decade. Quite a few things have happened in the way we try now to conceptualize the world. So this is part of the story. So we have this Anthropocene. Well, no, it's not really Anthropocene. It's unfair, you know, to blame everyone, because everyone knows that the Pareto principle, the 80-20 principle, applies. Or maybe even it's a 90-10 principle. 10% of the people are doing 90% of the damage, and the rest are just faced with a bill. You know, I mean, if you live in Bangladesh or if you live in the Sahel, you know all about this. You contribute next to nothing to carbon footprint, to climate change, but you are faced with the consequences. So Capitalocene perhaps is a more accurate way and I'm favorable to that. I think in many contexts it's fair to speak about the Capitalocene, that it's global capitalism and its propensity for and its insatiable hunger for growth and profit, which is part of the problem, especially when it's scaled up to a global scale. There is no moral accountability. You know, we see this. I mean, every day in the newspapers, how they're trying to make Facebook and Amazon pay taxes, and it's almost impossible. So maybe Capitalocene. So the Homogeneocene, which I'm also rather partial to that term, I must say, which is a third attempt to say something more specific about the time in which we live. It is a term that I have borrowed from the science writer Charles Mann, who wrote a book called 1493, and which actually is a very good book. It's not academic, but it's based on academic sources, but also a bit of that sort of typical American journalism, you know, where he travels and he speaks with people and he describes the landscape. But it's an enjoyable and enlightening book. And Mann says that what characterizes the world since Columbus, you know, this 1493, okay, after the conquest, the European conquest of the Americas, is, if anything, it's homogenization. It is flattening. And he's especially interested in the flow of foodstuffs, plants, you know, plants, animals, cattle in Argentina, South potatoes in China, maize in South Africa, orchards, apple orchards in Western Norway, sheep in New Zealand, and we could go on. The way in which there's been a reduction in diversity in the way in which we make a living in the world, which somehow there's a parallel here, which I think we can do something with, and which I'm hoping to do something with myself, between the flattening of cultural difference owing to nationalism. Everybody had to be citizens, they should be loyal, they should go to the same schools, they should apply for the same jobs, they should contribute to the same sort of coffers of the GDP of the state, and they should be easy to send out in a war because they were loyal citizens who were willing to die for the country, for their imagined community. And there's a parallel between this analysis and the analysis of the Columbian exchange, you know, or the legacy of the Columbian exchange, which was initially described by the historian Alfred Crosby in the 1970s. And Mann has this sort of takes it for a new spin. How we, human beings, I mean, of the 365,000 species of plant that are known, human beings have been able to exploit 7,000 for food. But we now rely on just 12 species. I mean, you know, 75% of what we eat in the world, I think it's roughly 75, I don't have the figures, but much, much more than half of what we eat in the world is composed of just 12 species of plant and 5 animal species. Okay, so there's been an enormous standardization of food as a result of the Columbian and the post-Columbian exchange. Not all of it is bad. I mean, not all foreign species are bad. I don't know about if there is any controversy around the oaks in Stellenbosch, but I think it's rather nice. I mean, but there may be more controversial than I'm aware of. Okay, yeah, they are aliens, but some aliens can actually be quite enriching. You know, that's the thing. I had this conversation with an environmentalist in Australia. Australia, which is even more, you know, more vulnerable and more sort of threatened by alien species than South Africa. You have the cane toad. I've written about the cane toad in my book from Australia, and the rabbit and many other foreign species. And his view was that anything that wasn't here at the time of the arrival of the first fleet in 1788 shouldn't be here. But then you sort of think, I mean, doesn't he want to have an apple tree in his garden? You know, I mean, doesn't he want? I mean, his uncle was a sheep farmer, and so on. And then I started to look at him because he was a white Australian, and his ancestors weren't here in 1788. So that kind of Puritanism becomes impracticable, and so we have to be more pragmatic, and we have to be more, you know, specific when we talk about invasions. But anyway, the homogenization, quite clearly there is homogenization. There's no doubt about it. And the Plantationocene, which has also been proposed, I think by Anna Tsing and others who have spoken about, and also Donna Haraway, who coined this unpronounceable last word, the Chulocene, which refers to, I think, a kind of fungus. Anyway, the Plantationocene is also good. It's a good concept to think with, because the plantation was the proto-factory. It replaced rainforests. It standardized, it McDonaldized the production of phenomena such as, or products such as cotton and sugar in large areas. I mean, this was not the topic when I did fieldwork in Mauritius, but it certainly would have been had I gone there now, namely the fact that 52% of the land surface of Mauritius is cultivated with sugarcane. And what are the implications for the biodiversity of that island, which, among other things, is famous for having been the only home of the now extinct dodo, you know, this fat flightless bird that was exterminated by not only by the Portuguese and Dutch, but also by their rats. You know, the rat is a main culprit when it comes to the reduction of biodiversity in many parts of the world. So, so there are many bits, and I haven't gone into the more tricky theoretical discussions about the, you know, the frontiers or the boundaries or the non-boundaries between that which is human and that which is not. And I think I don't think I'm going to do it today unless you want me to. But then just very quickly move on to a bit more context before I speak about the reduction in biological diversity and the possible reduction in cultural diversity, because that's what I'm trying to get my head around is simply a way in which we can view the reduction in cultural diversity and in biological diversity through the same lens, so that we don't make a distinction, an artificial distinction between biology and culture, which I don't think is going anywhere. So let's see where we can get. But in order to get there, first, just a little bit about the accelerated globalization that we've seen just in the last 3 decades, which has been massive since the end of the Cold War. Well, the end of the Cold War also marked the release of Mandela from prison and the liberation, you might say, of South Africa. South Africa became a member of the global community of nation states, just as Eastern Europe. I mean, these days it's more difficult to speak of that than it would have been a few weeks ago. But you see what I mean? The whole world, in a sense, became part of a global capitalist system from the early 1990s, which was also the time when the cell phone came into the world. You know, the mobile phone, suddenly you could communicate with anybody, everywhere. Everybody was available to everybody else anywhere in the world. That was something quite new, mind-boggling. You know, the telephone directory. I mean, some of you young people haven't even seen a telephone directory. The phone book, which was about this thick, and you needed the magnifying glass to read it, and you needed the phone book in order to find out how to get in touch with people. And if they weren't in, they weren't in. So then you had to leave a message. So that happened around the same time. The mobile phone and the internet also started to grow quickly from the early 90s. We got email at my university in Oslo around 1991. And we still, at the beginning, we first saw it as a kind of toy. It was fun, you know. You could send a message to someone in Australia and see if they got it. We didn't use it for serious correspondence. But then after a few years, it became part of the air that we breathed. And it was as if it had always been there. They're both mobile phones and the internet. It was as if it had always been there, but it's not that such a long time ago that, in fact, these things didn't exist. So all of these tendencies converged in the early 1990s, the end of the Cold War and the opening up, the liberation or the deregulation of the Indian economy, one of the larger economies in the world, the establishment of East Asia as an equal economic partner in global capitalism. And these technological changes took place at the same time. So this project called Overheating is very much about some of the effects and responses to these accelerated changes. What we could speak of as the acceleration of acceleration, because there is a book which was published in 2016, same year as my Overheating book, so that's why I'm not quoting it, called The Great Acceleration, by John McNeill and Peter Engelke, The Great Acceleration, which is about the world after around 1950, after the end of the Second World War, really, where we have seen accelerated change in many domains. But my argument has been that, in fact, since the 1990s, we've seen an acceleration of that acceleration in anything to do with the economy, world trade, tourism. You can look at it from many, the production of waste in the world, the production of cement, of plastic, all of this has grown at an enormous speed since the early 1990s. Before the general lockdown, I mean, 2 years ago, the number of plane tickets sold in the world had more than doubled in just 15 years. Okay, from 2004 to 2019, the number of plane tickets had grown from 2 billion to nearly 4.5 billion. I mean, these are abstract. This is very abstract. But what we're interested in as anthropologists is, okay, how does this affect people's lives? How does this change people's lives on the ground? Not every person's lives. Most people have never taken a flight, but those who do fly more often than before. And what are the implications? That kind of thing. Or take this, you know, the fact that between 2010 and 2015, in just the space of 5 years, the number of photos taken in the world by private persons trebled, okay, from 0.33 trillion to 1 trillion. I mean, nobody knows how much a trillion is, okay? And it trebled. And everybody knows why. It's because most photos are now taken with phones. Everybody carries a relatively decent camera with them wherever they go. But it says nothing about how this affects our way of perceiving and relating to the image. The fact that images are now ubiquitous and free and instant and are posted online on a growing number of platforms continuously, all the time. So this is the kind of world in which we now live, and that we have to come to terms with. And another aspect of that world, of course, is the fact that I mean, yes, there is growth in renewables, but at the moment, it's too little and too late, as you can see from this diagram. That coal consumption is still growing. Indonesia, which 20 years ago was a non-entity in the production of fossil fuels, is now the second largest coal exporter in the world, after Australia, the second largest coal exporter. And imagine the implications, the consequences of these changes for people who live in those parts of Indonesia which are affected. Many of them are in Borneo, rainforests, indigenous groups, etc. So yeah, I could go through several other of these graphs which show that there is, you know, okay, population trends. I mean, there are many of these trends which point upwards. But what we know about exponential growth is that it cannot go on forever. Okay, so it will end with a bang or with a whimper. It will collapse or it will peter out. And this is happening with population growth. And it may also happen in some of the other domains. But at the moment, the tendency has been, you might say, a globally overheated modernity. Overheated, not just in the literal sense of climate change and increased temperature, but of increased speed. that there is an acceleration. There's more of everything. Okay, so yeah, and just as a reminder of the fact that it's not equally distributed. So the per capita CO2 emissions look like this. I haven't found out why Mongolia is so dark, but there must be a reason. Mongolia is very thinly populated, small population, but you see here that there is a clear hierarchy, global hierarchy. Okay, so, and the world in which we live now, if I were to choose just two objects that define the contemporary world, I mean, the world is a very big place. I'm perfectly well aware of that. So I'm just giving a very general sort of scaffolding. But it is the world of the shipping container and the smartphone. And they both are interesting when we think about diversity and the loss of diversity in many ways, because the shipping container is a symbol of standardization par excellence, isn't it? It has to be standardized itself before the containerization of shipping, just like all the little accents and dialects and identities you had before the coming of the state and the market and modernity and nationalism. Shipping goods was much less efficient. It was much more expensive. The costs of distribution and shipping were fairly high, which meant, among other things, that no matter how cheaply you could produce Barbie dolls in China, you wouldn't be able to make big inroads into the Midwest market in Minnesota, places like that, because the cost of transport would exceed, you know, the discrepancy between the cost of production in the Midwest and China. This is no longer a problem. Since the 1960s, increasingly, and now almost universally, shipping containers are standardized. Well, that wasn't me. Could have been.
I apologize.
And it's been, I mean, all shipping containers, whether they're called Hanjin or Maersk, whether they're made in Korea or in Denmark, they're exactly the same dimensions and they fit into the same ships. Ships have been rebuilt. You remember the image from Easter last year of this container ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. And did you see those excavators, those sort of machines that try to sort of dig away the sand for it to come loose? And they looked like tiny toys compared to the ship, which was huge. It was one of the largest ones. And only since the beginning of this century, only since around 2002, the average size of a container ship has trebled. So they're 3 times as big. And they were pretty big in 2002 as well. So, this speaks volumes, I think, of a certain form of standardization. Ports have to be standardized. They all have to, you know, have the same kinds of cranes, you know, the same railway tracks running all the way down. Unlike in the past, you know, just like coal mining in the past was very labor intensive, it is now increasingly open pit, which means that coal mines are more and more beginning to resemble oil platforms, with just a few employees who are well paid, who have a comfortable roster, and who sit sort of in some kind of air-conditioned cabin, listening to AC/DC, sipping a Pepsi Max, and removing very large quantities of gravel and soil to get to the coal. I mean, I've known some of those people doing fieldwork in Australia. Okay, one of them, I mean, he worked as a coal miner. He had a degree in psychology, but he said that, you know, now, I mean, this job is so much better than being an underpaid academic, that it was a no-brainer for me. So he had that kind of job, whereas in the past there were armies of coal miners, and in this book called Carbon Democracy by Timothy in Norwegian called the planet of the apps, okay? So I use it to measure my blood sugar levels because I'm a diabetic. And it's going low now, but no worries, I'm going to get something to eat within an hour or so, and it's still in the green. Had it been in the red, I'd been a bit worried and asked some of you if you had a Coke or a piece of chocolate, but no worries. So I can use it for this. We use it for so many things, and the world has become so frictionless and so easy to navigate, to maneuver. Where would you have been? Where would I have been without Google Maps driving around in the Western Cape? I would have got lost so many times in just a morning. We use it for services, for entertainment, for coordination, for communication. But the point that I want to make here is that it is inherently reductionist, because if whatever you have to offer cannot be communicated through an app, it somehow doesn't exist. It somehow it disappears from the radar. If it cannot be appified, it is not competitive in the contemporary market of services and communication. So it's it's absolutely massive, and I haven't even started to talk about surveillance technologies and the world described by Shoshana Zuboff and others. But that will have to wait, because I'm more interested in how this affects diversity on an everyday level. Does the smartphone make the world more or less diverse? Well, in one sense, it certainly makes it less diverse, because we all say different things, but we now have to do it through the same medium. And I mean, as the late Ernest Gellner once said about the effects of nationalism, people still speak different languages, but nowadays they increasingly say pretty much the same things. I think he underestimated the range of cultural diversity, but there is some truth to that. So, okay, so let me move on. Oh, I've already spoken for a little while, but no worries, I'll begin to wrap up pretty soon. So there are some very, very obvious ways in which we can talk about reduction of cultural diversity. Some of them are more tricky, more problematic than others. The effects of the smartphone can be debated. Some would say that, no, it leads to more diversity, not less. I've seen this in the Seychelles, how in fact the smartphone is being used and the new media are being used to strengthen local cultural expressions which may otherwise have been lost. It's always an empirical question. The world is not flat, the world is still bumpy. And so there is more diversity than often meets the eye. So in Seychelles, people use Facebook, and most Seychellois, I mean, they access the internet and Facebook via their smartphones. Most Seychellois don't have laptops, but they have a phone. So they access Facebook, and on Facebook there are many pages dedicated to the Creole language, okay, which is spoken just by 95,000 people. So it's a very small language, and many are worried. Many Seychellois intellectuals, people in the tiny University of the Seychelles who work with Creole questions, are worried about the eventual demise of the Creole language because of the predominance of English and French. Through tourism, travel, education, Netflix, all the kinds of the sources that people have to get information from outside. So the fact that there are now Facebook pages which are dedicated to the Creole language, where people communicate, they write Creole, which they never do in any other setting, and they even publish poetry in Creole on Facebook, could be said to be one way of using this inherently standardizing technology to strengthen a form of diversity. So, I mean, so there's no simple answer. There are lots of caveats, and I'm going to go through some of them very quickly afterwards. But one way in which we can speak about the loss of cultural diversity, which is less debatable, is by looking at language death. The way in which, I mean, some linguists argue that of the around 6,000 languages currently spoken, maybe as many as 90% will be more or less gone in just a generation. I'm not sure about this. I mean, I haven't looked at the data, so, and it's a very general thing to say, but languages are being, they disappear continuously, small languages. disappear continuously. The fact of you see the general sort of the general argument, so I don't have to go through it in any detail. General purpose money, the market, common denominators, everything comparable to everything else. The state performs many of the same actions by turning people into citizens, increasing the so we become citizens and consumers, and the art of not being governed, to invoke another book by James Scott, where he speaks about these hill peoples in Southeast Asia, which have managed to keep the state at bay for centuries. Not so much a monetary economy, but they are autonomous, increasingly difficult. Everybody knows this. And now let's just take a look at the parallels in biodiversity. Flattening effects of capitalism and the state and globalization. This is, I think many of you have seen this illustration. It's gone around, for a year or two since the publication of a WWF report in 2020, which indicates that, there's been an average decrease of 68% in population sizes of mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and fish between 1970 and 2016. So in 46 years, an average decrease of 68%. And for many groups of animals, the figures are even worse. Wildlife populations in freshwater habitats had suffered a decline of 84%. So things are happening. Serious things are happening to biodiversity as we speak. And this illustration indicates that, 4% of not individual mammals, but of mammalian biomass. 4% now belongs to wild mammals. 36% are us, 60% remaining percent are livestock. And there's a similar illustration that I haven't included, which depicts birds. 70% of all the birds are now poultry, mainly chickens. Okay, so what are the implications of what I have said so far about globalization, about flattening, about standardization for the study of diversity? One tricky thing is the very conceptualization of diversity, and perhaps that is something that we might want to discuss. How should we conceptualize? How can we cannot gauge cultural diversity, can we? Cannot measure it, but we can talk about it. So I'm saying here entities and relationships. So we must look at not entities, but relationships. I now very quickly move towards the end of the talk, and I think I'm going to need some carbohydrates. I've got some here. You see, one of the things that I can easily digest, you see, is this kind of stuff. So the implications for the way we study diversity. I have a suggestion. Okay, one way of studying diversity without reintroducing an artificial and ultimately unproductive contrast between culture and biology is by looking at communication. Process rather than structure, relationships rather than entities. People who are serious about the study of invasive species tell me that it's not so much a loss of individual species that matters. It's the loss of the conditions for biodiversity. So you mustn't look at individual species. You mustn't say that now we're going to save the Californian condor. You must say that now we're going to do something about air pollution in order to create the conditions for a diverse world. So we must look at the entire ecology, the ecosystem, the semiosphere, the world of communication, rather than the entities. And similarly, we must look at processes, and we mustn't forget that ecosystems and cultural worlds have changed in the past, and they will continue to change. There is no pristine, as it were, authentic, original world of purity. So I'm now going to introduce the theories that many of you would not have heard about, who could provide some cues as to how we can go about studying diversity. And I'm going to do this quickly, and then we can move on to a discussion afterwards. So Jesper Hoffmeier, who was one of the pioneering people developing this new field called biosemiotics. Biosemiotics is an attempt to study communication, whether human or non-human or multi-species, as the fundamental aspect of life, communication. It's the exchange of signs. So it's influenced by people like Gregory Bateson, obviously early pioneer in biosemiotics, and the philosopher Peirce. And Jesper Hoffmeyer says the origin of life is the origin of the environment. And he invokes the concept of the Umwelt, which is a German word referring to the perceived surroundings, the perceived environment for any organism. And just a couple of concepts that he uses, which I think are useful. Semiotic freedom. Every organism has some degree of semiotic freedom, which means that you can do things differently. Even a plant can stretch its roots in a particular direction and not in another direction. I'm not saying that that plants make choices, okay, but that they communicate with their surroundings. And we have increasingly, I mean, we've got some very interesting, some quite recent research now on the way in which plants, trees communicate through subterranean fungal networks and in various other ways. But obviously, other organisms have more semiotic freedoms. You can talk about organisms as having more or less semiotic freedom. And let me just give you one very short example from his work that illustrates the meaning of the usefulness of distinguishing between degrees of semiotic freedom. Okay. So consider a snake chasing a mouse. The mouse runs ahead of the snake comes after it, the mouse hides behind a shrub. So the snake can't see it, and it can't perceive it, because the mouse lies completely still. There's no vibration in the ground, okay, that's the snake can perceive. The snake looks around a bit, and then it just slinks off in another direction, because it has no mental image of the mouse having hidden behind the shrub. Now a dog chases the same mouse, and now you know what I'm going to say, okay? The mouse runs around the shrub, lies there completely still. The dog sniffs around a bit, and it then moves in the opposite direction to surprise the mouse, because it has a mental image of the mouse moving behind the shrub and hiding. So in other words, the dog has a greater degree of semiotic freedom than the mouse. And Bateson, I mean, also wrote about dogs. In one of his articles about play and fantasy, he describes the way in which a dog can pretend to bite its owner. You know, it plays with you, okay? You have a dog, it plays with you, and it pretends to bite you. But at the same time as it pretends to bite, it also wags its tail. So it's capable of meta-communication, of telling you that I'm just joking, I'm pulling your leg. I'm literally pulling your leg. I'm just pretending to bite you, but it's just play, it's just fun. I've got a cat, and he's not capable of that, you see. So I would say that in this particular respect, the dog has greater semiotic freedom than the cat. But maybe in other domains, the cat has more. But what I wanted to say is that semiotic freedom is a way of thinking about the way we communicate with the world, the options we have. In Bateson's terms, we might talk about flexibility. Flexibility defined as uncommitted potential for change, the potential you have for doing things differently. Now, Hoffmeyer says in one of his last and most, I guess, authoritative statements, he said that if there is one fact, indisputable fact about the evolutionary process, it is that it has entailed a growth in semiotic freedom. There is more. There are more organisms. There is more going on. There are more differences that make a difference, to use Bateson's term. More differences that make a difference. And we could think about cultural history along the same lines. There has been a diversification since we left Africa, maybe 70, 80,000 years ago, and before we left Africa, a diversification in groups with separate identities, customs, musics, food traditions, cosmologies. So there's more. Now I'm skipping this. This is just a definition of semiotic freedom. And what we seem to see now is something fairly dramatic, namely a reduction. in semiotic freedom. The replacement of a plantation with, a replacement of rainforest with a plantation leads to a reduction in signification, a reduction in the exchange of signs. Yes, many signs are still being exchanged between the trees or the plants in the plantation, but they're all the same. There's less diversity. So I'm saying, I mean, I'm not going into this now because I've already spoken long enough, but the evolutionary process, in the slow evolutionary process out there, is a negentropic force. It prevents the obliteration of difference. It contributes to the production of new differences that make a difference. And culture does the same in the human world of meaning production. So I'm thinking that maybe we can try to think these two processes together. And my argument is that, yeah, well, I won't have the time to go into this now, but there's a nice quotation from Goethe that I'm going to let hang there a little bit. That until now, until the Anthropocene, there has been an increase in semiotic freedom in the world, an increase in diversity and complexity. And it now seems to be reversed, owing to the forces of globalization, a reversal of this diversification. And Goethe cynically said, you know, in his lecture and later article, Anti-Relativism, that, yeah, cultural differences will doubtless remain. The French will never eat salted butter, but the good old days of widow burning and cannibalism are gone forever. So that's a story about disenchantment, about what Max Weber spoke of as Entzäubung, you know, the disenchantment of the world. I'm not saying that he's right, and there are many caveats. We could look at those afterwards during the discussion. I think what anthropology increasingly is about is there's a form of urgency as a result of the homogenizing forces of globalization and of environmental destruction and climate change that makes it a paramount and an imperative task for us to argue against the Tina doctrine. There is no alternative doctrine, by saying instead that Tama, there are many alternatives. And we're in the privileged position to do so, owing to the history of the discipline. And that biosemiotics, which I've only been able to sketch in a very sort of a very superficial way, could be a tool for, in fact, critiquing these effects of global capitalism, the flattening effects. Okay, I'm not sure if I made myself clear towards the end, maybe not, but maybe during the discussion that we can clarify a few things. So thank you for listening so far. And I'll put this here so that you know that I'm not. I don't think that this is simple and straightforward. Now, many questions that need to be asked.
Thank you very much. I mean, there's so much to think through here, so I think people probably need a little bit of time, or are others, are people ready? Okay, Simon, we can rely on Simon to have already come up with a question. So we normally just take about 3 questions at a time. It's up to you.
That's excellent.
We have more than enough time for discussion. So, thanks for laying this out. It's really.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. And I mean, I've developed a whole number of questions. I've got 3. I'm going to go third, second, and then ask the first. The third question is, you use the word destabilization, and I'm not certain what is meant by it. Mm-hmm. The second question is, do you think in the developing world, and you've done research in the developing world, that the priorities regarding development are often different from the priorities regarding development in the developed world, and where in the developing world, how high up or low down should the climate challenges be? Mm-hmm. But if I may, my first question is the one that I would most like to put to you. I was asked about 4 months ago to give a presentation to a group in Bordeaux in France, and I gave a presentation on cities in Africa. And the first question I was asked afterwards was, why on earth have you not said anything about climate change? And that's the statement. Since then, I've been trying to find out more about what has been happening in the north and in Scandinavia, and I've come across the work of Andreas Mullen from the University of Lund in Sweden. And he argues, if I understand his argument as follows, he argues that there is a real dilemma regarding eco-activism. You've got ecto-activism, which is trying to change the capitalocene, as you called it, and is trying to do so across the first world, but also in the developing world. And it is using a peaceful approach. And the dilemma is it's not really having the impact that it should have, because if you go to Stockholm, you go to COP26 in Glasgow, you've got the words, you've got the rhetoric, but you don't get the action. So we have to, through that dilemma, we have to become more violent. Now, I was wondering what you think of that argument.
Yes.
So you want to take this one, because there were three.
I could. These are three. Yeah. Okay. If I can, yes. Yes, these are, thanks very much indeed. These are very big questions. So yes, I mean, priorities will inevitably differ. I mean, regarding the relationship between climate and development. I mean, as I said, you know, I think I mentioned it during the lecture that perhaps 10% of the world's population are responsible for 90% of the climate emissions. So it is neither here nor there to tell Bangladeshis to stop eating red meat. You know, that's not where we are. But maybe that is a place to start with people like myself. So quite clearly there will have to be local perceptions and local solutions to these problems. In fact, there's a book that I just co-edited, which came out last month, called Cooling Down, which is on local approaches to climate change, where we go into local communities. I mean, anthropologists who have worked in Bangladesh and in New Zealand and in Austria and in other countries, both in the global north and the south, to try to find out how the local discourses, local policies, local perceptions are, and local priorities, which would differ. So yes, obviously that is quite clear. And the big question there is to do with the relationship between climate and inequality, which are often seen as two opposing considerations, two opposing priorities. You can't have one without having the other, which I think is absolutely wrong. But it is still something which is sometimes argued. And the environmental movement is not always very helpful in this. So, for example, since I quoted the late Edward O. Wilson, I mean, I'm sure he wouldn't have minded my quoting him on this, but he said, I mean, in an interview some years ago, that we should set aside at least a third of the planet, or maybe half the planet, for wilderness, without, you know, human, as it were, interventions at all. The only problem is that you don't find half of the planet where humans don't live and make a living. So how are we going to do that? It seemed to me a very anti-humanist way of thinking about the natural and the cultural world as being two very separate domains, and where people can just be moved if they interfere too much with nature. And this is a trend in conservationism which you can trace back to the mid-19th century. I mean, John Muir, one of the founders of the American environmental movement and one of the founders of the American national parks in the 1850s, he didn't have much time for indigenous peoples, you know, who lived in those areas, in Yosemite and in other areas that he wanted to have as pristine, untouched, as it were, areas. So, and this ontology, I mean, it's based on a flawed contrast between, you know, human activities and nature as being two opposing and competing entities. So yeah, so that at least goes some way to answer. The first, destabilization, I think I can answer that much more quickly. Destabilization, well, maybe all societies are unstable. We all change. But what we see in this period, at this particular time, in many parts of the world, is that different parts of a culture change at different speeds. And some things change really quickly. So you get a mismatch and a disconnect between parts of your lives which were better integrated in the past. Andreas Malm, his recent book called How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Yes, I mean, he's very knowledgeable and he's very engaged. And you might say he belongs to the more militant part of the environmentalist movement. I have discussions going with him. In fact, I've invited him up to Oslo in late spring, the late North European spring this year. So we're going to have a discussion then about some of his views. No, I don't think it's the way to go. I don't think sabotage is the way to go, personally. I'd rather try other means. So on that he and I don't agree. Yeah. But the issue that he raised is, I mean, the main issue that he raised is that in fact there is, for one thing, climate debate is very racialized. Environmentalism is racialized, and there is a tension between environmentalism, climate activism, and the struggle against inequality, which is unresolved. I think that is important, and there's still some work to be done there. Okay.
Thank you, and I'm sorry about my telephone that rang in the middle of your...
Not at all.
Yeah, well, and can people please briefly introduce yourself? And so are there other hands as well as earlier? What point you go?
Hi, I'm Efwa. I'm in this department. I'm an anthropologist, medical anthropologist. Thank you for your presentation. Of course, there's a great number of departure points, so I'm going to try and be as succinct as possible. And it's a sort of carry on from your last comment here about the relationship between environmentalism and maybe a geopolitical race question, and then to somehow make a comment on, you know, I mean, the United Nations decade, 1995 to 2004, the decentralizing indigenous rights movement, and part of the work that the indigenous rights movement was trying to put forward was this close relationship between humans and the natural world and inverted commas. Part of that natural world. And then also to make a comment on the history of, I guess, perhaps maybe the post-colonial encounter, and then this relationship between conservationist science and how conservationism, as it materialized on the continent, necessarily meant shoving out of indigenous populations. So of course, it is a question of race, and it's a question of representativity and power. And then also to just, you know, you mentioned this sort of classical anthropology, and my quandary, my thing is that, you know, by and large, the practice of anthropology has been about these indigenous, you know, primitive societies. And the questions that have been asked in those primitive societies have been about witchcraft, the aesthetics of the Ashanti, the Nuer, you know. And instead of looking at, I mean, I suppose maybe my complaint is to lay it at the table of anthropologists who chose to look at particular things that were seen as remarkable, and not this close relationship between that and the scene. And then suddenly, as you quite rightly say, you know, the rise in the 1990s, and possibly even now in 2020, now we're starting as anthropologists to look at this close relationship between nature and humans, which is also a great point. But I guess my it's more, I don't know if I have a question, but it's more of sort of a discursive moment.
Yes.
How can we, it feels almost a bit frustrating because the indigenous rights movement, communities in these sort of peasant, agricultural, primitive societies have been talking about this for so long, and it's just about representation and power. How do we as anthropologists actually listen better?
Yes.
And there's a fantastic phrase, I was teaching the students the other day, It's commented by an anthropologist, Owusu Brempong from Ghana, called their Kano. And one of the phrases in Twi, in English, is the viewer has big eyes. It's less about, the work of translation is that it is the way in which things are seen and the way in which things are heard that determine the longevity and I suppose the representativity. Yeah, so that's.
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you. That was a very, very rich, I mean, mainly comment. When you refer to the 1995 statement, you're thinking about this, about biocultural diversity? Was that what you had in mind? The idea about biocultural diversity, which was sanctioned by the United Nations sometime in the 1990s.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, more in South America.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
People, and how it was this real contestation of power and money, that indigenous, land was being changed to single crop, to plantations, and by and large the voices were silent, and Pachamama, and then suddenly it was almost like infantilized. It was,
I know.
Paternalistic tone to it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And there were some interesting conflicts. In Ecuador, activists and various interested parties managed to get a formulation about respecting Pachamama into the constitution at some point. And the president, Rafael Correa, was not pleased, with this, because he was a socialist. He wanted development. He said, we want to lift these people out of poverty and get them an education and a good job, and so that they can get somewhere in the world. He saw it as regressive. So this is, and it's quite important, to keep that conflict in mind, because it says that it reminds us that this is not just about, do-gooders, NGOs, whatever, or imperialist powers from abroad, but these are internal conflicts that you find within the very same societies within Ecuador. But when it comes to this shift in anthropology that I alluded to at the beginning of the lecture, quite clearly, South America, research in South America has been very important. On the indigenous groups in South America has been incredibly important. Anything from Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, to Philippe Descola and many others. One of my favorites is Eduardo Kohn, The Secret Life, How Forests Think. And he draws on biosemiotics and also on various other theoretical attempts to overcome the artificial distinction, well, two artificial distinctions really, between us and them, which you also alluded to, which is a post-colonial or the colonial framework, the us and them the contrast, which we still haven't quite left behind in anthropology either, and the nature culture. So it's attempts to overcome this. And we sometimes pride ourselves on, as anthropologists, of being different from other academics in that we do not only develop theory by discussing with other intellectuals and by reading philosophers, but through engaging with local communities that give us theoretical ideas. And we should perhaps walk our talk to a greater extent. But I believe that this may be happening now, because of the Anthropocene effects and because indigenous skills and knowledge are coming more to the forefront and are being engaged with in a more serious way by many. That's one thing. And another thing is that I think we should get far more studies about contradictions and dilemmas in the global north, so in connection with climate. I can only think of a handful of studies that actually take on, the upper middle classes of the world and their contradictory relationship to this, where you say one thing and you do another and you rationalize and so on. There's one book which happens to be based on fieldwork in Norway called Living in Denial, by an American, well, she's really a sociologist, but she worked ethnographically, called Living in Denial by Kari Marie Norgard. So she has a Norwegian name, but she is American. But it's obviously of Norwegian parentage. So she came and had to pick up the language and learned it and did fieldwork. And her question was, how can this enlighten people? She was working in this sort of rural town. How can this enlighten people? So highly educated, so affluent, and so well oriented. How can they behave the way they do? buying their imported beef from Botswana and traveling on weekend trips to London and driving and living very unsustainably, while they know that they shouldn't. You know, and this is an interesting question, isn't it? That should be raised, and we should have more studies of that kind of this kind of group. Oh. So there is something, but there is, you know, there's a book by Joy Henry, which I think is rather nice. Joy Henry from 2014. I don't remember the title at the moment, but it alludes to, which is about indigenous knowledge systems and the way in which they can tell us something about being in the world that we may make use of also in our academic research as anthropologists. You know, I personally think that there is a lot to be had from engaging with and learning from these indigenous cosmologies and knowledge systems. But it's quite another thing to transpose them to the kind of social organization we have, which is a very different kind of society. We assume that a cultural world and a social, that there is some kind of consistency between the social and the cultural world. And a cosmology which works in Amazon. It might be that it could work in Manhattan, but I'm not sure. Okay.
Interesting issues emerging. Any questions, concepts, comments? A lot of concepts.
I think Cheryl.
Well,
yeah. You want to introduce
thank
yourself?
you. Yes, I'm Cheryl Walker in this department, working on environmental issues amongst other things. But I was wanting to just try to understand, perhaps it's been touched on by the other questions, as the relationship between the task of and taking forward the ideas around semiotic freedoms and politics.
Yes. Yes.
So if I understand you're looking at semiotic freedom as you talk about it in relation to potential for doing things differently. And,
yes.
Yes. And then you talk about the reduction in semiotic freedoms as a result of globalization.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the question then is, why are we not doing things differently, perhaps?
Yes.
When we have these potentials. So it's around, which leads to a question around the
thank you.
politics, but
Yeah.
also trying to understand what the concept of semiotic freedom is.
Yeah.
More.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot, Cheryl. These concepts and the entire sort of field of biosemiotics is very apolitical at the outset. You know, I mean, even Gregory Bateson was not very political. He did have thoughts about the causes of the ecological crisis, but it was at a very sort of theoretical level of cybernetics. So so it's up to other people to show how it can be put to use in order to understand political processes, which I think it can. So I mean, think about the dominance of the way in which our lives are dominated by technology, and the way in which we seem to have a restricted choice. And I believe this is also why those people whom I just mentioned, who are living in denial, that they know that they should behave in a certain way, but they can't, because they are somehow they're locked in a system that we're locked in a system that we haven't created ourselves, and which tells us that we have freedom, and choice is now the way in which people talk about freedom as a sort of, in a way, a very neoliberal way of thinking about freedom as being individual choice. But you can only choose within a certain, I mean, a rather narrow range. And this is why I think the app and the shipping container are good metaphors for thinking about the loss of semiotic freedom, because you have every choice in the world, but it has to fit into your smartphone. Or you can buy anything you like, but it has to be packed in a shipping container and probably mass produced, otherwise you wouldn't be able to get it. So yes, I think that is one. But in order to really get to it, I mean, you need to do the political economy analysis, which I haven't done here, in order to really get to what is happening. I mean, the constraints.
of knowledge and the academy in particular. The one thing that jumped out at me is you made the statement, we cannot, of course, we cannot measure cultural diversity. And in the same token, you know, a couple of minutes later, you're doing that by talking about language data and quoting statistics from linguists, which, you know, it makes sense in the sense. You wouldn't make that statement, you probably wouldn't make the statement, you cannot measure biodiversity, I'm guessing.
That's also,
yeah. I mean, if you're trying to think the two together, I'm interested in how you
thanks,
made
Phil.
that statement. You cannot measure cultural diversity.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Very, very, very challenging, difficult questions. Well, I think the move from nationalism to biosemiotics. Well, you know, nationalism, modernity, homogenization. It's also about communication, and it's also about, you might say, a certain degree of entropy, not in the sense that there is less information going around, but there is more information of the same kind. So just like the trees in a plantation, the relationship between trees in a plantation, which are very different from the relationship between trees in the rainforest. So I think I believe I will be able to, when I get down to writing this, that I'll be able to defend that view. But regarding the measuring of biodiversity, I think that is also very difficult, and it's also a big question: how much biodiversity do we want? How much biodiversity do we need? Is every species equally important? No, not really. It turns out that some of the people are looking at this seriously. They conclude that in many ecosystems there are sort of 2 or 3 what they call keystone species, which are crucial, and they're often among the more common ones. There are in England there are something like 168 species of moths, and about 60 of them are seriously endangered. But perhaps nobody would miss them. You know, if there is no niche that in which they need, I've discussed. I have a friend who's a marine biologist, and I've discussed, you know, the use of jellyfish. What would happen with the ecosystems of the world's oceans if jellyfish suddenly disappeared? And he says that, well, there are some species that might be in trouble. You know, some turtles might be in trouble, but apart from that, there is no obvious function. So it's not as if, it's not we're not living in that Hegelian world where the real is irrational and the rational is the real, or a functionalist world where everything fits into the big jigsaw. So measuring biodiversity can also be quite tricky. But I would say, you know, it's not a number. I mean, it's not something that you can't. When I started to speak about language, it was just a way of saying that, well, I mean, we have some quantitative indications that something is happening, but by all means, I don't think that's the way to go. I think we should try to describe systems instead. And the thing about biosemiotics is, you know, that it's got an interesting diverse genealogy. I mean, one is the genealogy that goes back to semiotics and to, you know, Peirce's philosophy, and people like Gregory Bateson, who was also a communications man. But the other genealogy goes back to ethology, you know, the study of animal behavior, which is also now being rediscovered by some, you know, so not least some of our colleagues. I mean, my interest in multi-species fieldwork, that in fact there were people, some of them were discredited during the war. You know, Konrad Lorenz, I mean, he was one of the great German ethologists, but he ended up on the wrong side during the war, so that makes it made it a bit difficult to relate to his work afterwards. But they did some pioneering work on animal communication, trying very hard not to understand what it is like to be a bat, because we can't. We can't place ourselves in the head of a bat, but we can say something about what the bat does and how we can communicate with it. And I think this is the way to go, rather than trying to measure things.
Well, I know we've got a class starting here at 5, so we have to end up. But I just wanted to say it's a rather instrumentalist view of biodiversity you're putting forward.
Oh, you think so?
Well, it sounded so.
Oh, really? What did I say?
That's opening up another conversation.
Oh, yeah. Well, since I asked how much do we need, well,
only need
and those are we.
bats or moth because the rest don't suit us.
Yeah, but some ways, I mean, sometimes yes. I know it was a bit cheeky. I agree. I mean, it's not up to me to decide which species are necessary or not, by all means. But there are some heartening facts about, for example, areas that have been ravaged by fire. For example, everything is gone.
And then very often they regenerate themselves very quickly. They can regenerate themselves very quickly, which means that even if a lot of diversity is lost, if the territory is still there, if it's not covered by cement or infrastructure, it can actually recover. And think about the area around Chernobyl, around the nuclear power plant, which unfortunately is in trouble again, but for other and more evil reasons. But after the accident in 1986, there was this belt of several, I think, probably 100 kilometers around Chernobyl, which was a no-go area. And wildlife and plant life regenerated very quickly and became incredibly diverse, with bears and wolves and
rewilding.
Yeah, it was a natural form of rewilding. So I don't think all hope is gone. And but there are, I mean, there is an asymmetry obviously between the forces of capitalism and the state on the one hand, and the attempts to recover some of that lost diversity on the other.
I think that's an excellent way. No, I think this is a fantastic way to get us to think about these issues and start to continue this conversation. And tomorrow we're very fortunate to reconvene here at 1 o'clock. Professor William Baynard will be giving a seminar, and I hope you'll
I'll be here.
Fantastic. Yep. And I hope all of you will be here. I'm very excited by in-person seminars again. Feels like there's some hope in this world.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the crisis of COVID has maybe given us a sense of the value of relationality writ large. How's that funny? But thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for watching. And as I said, it's early days. It's work in progress, and it's going to end up very